They laughed as he pushed his dolly through the kitchen door, until one name made the room go silent. The morning cut clean across the city, sunlight striking the restaurant's brass letters so they shone like a promise. Belle Andrea's fine dining. Inside, chandeliers threw soft rain over white linen and polished silver. Outside, a narrow alley smelled of oil and dust, metal, and yesterday's ice. Elijah's shoes left faint smudges on the concrete as he rolled his load beneath a strip of indifferent sky. He moved like someone who had learned how to carry other people's expectations without breaking them. Boxes balanced, straps coiled, a small radio murmuring under his jacket. He knew the back of restaurants better than most people knew their own kitchens, where the mop bucket lived, which door stuck in the heat, the exact pitch of a cook's exasperated shout. He had once been a dishwasher. He'd learned the rhythm of plates, the coat of steam, the names stitched into aprons. It was not a boast. It was a map. From the service corridor, the laughter arrived like a low tide. A stifled snort, a smirk muffled by a napkin. A server motioned toward him with a tilted chin. A line cook lifted a hand to mouth and cupped a laugh as if it were a private joke. The amusement was small and rehearsed, the kind that makes a room feel smaller for the person it's pointed at. "Nice of you to join us," one voice said, not loud enough for Elijah to hear but loud enough for the ones who cared to listen. He kept his face careful and neutral, the way people keep hands when moving a fragile thing. He did not answer. He had the rhythm of a man who had learned to let the work speak, and work did speak, in a steady language of deliveries stacked and signed. He set a crate down where it belonged, checked the list, smiled professionally at Greg, who gave the smile back with a tilt. Polite, but not kindly. Damien, the head chef, had hands that carried authority like heat. He'd spent years in kitchens where barking order was the language of survival. Today, his eyes scanned Elijah with the practiced appraisal chefs use on a new hire, except Elijah was not a new hire. He was a delivery man. At least he appeared so, and that made him easier to dismiss. Elijah heard the whispers, soft, precise, like the way people talk when they want to keep cruelty off the record. "Too many people in the city think they belong somewhere they don't," someone muttered. Another voice chuckled, "You know how it is." The words were small, almost thoughtful, and for that reason they cut deeper. They had done the small things that add up, a missed box set in a place where Elijah would look like he'd dropped something, a server stepping into his path with a theatrical sigh, a bottle knocked slightly as he reached around it. The pranks were designed by people who had been taught to be petty and labeled as humor. The room had become a rehearsed chorus of superiority, soft laughter the refrain. Elijah straightened each time. He replaced the fallen crate with steady hands, wiped a smudge from marble with the sleeve of his jacket, when a young server feigned a startle and said, "Watch where you put those." Elijah's reply was a quiet, "Thank you," and then he moved on. Calm is not weakness, he thought to himself. Calm is a decision that keeps the world from tumbling into what someone else wants it to be. He had learned to carry two things at once, the weight of the delivery and the memory of his first nights at the sinks. The dish room had taught him about patience and about how sweat becomes part of the floor. He could name the managers he'd worked for, the shift patterns he'd kept, the times he'd stayed until dawn washing someone else's mistakes away. Those memories were small pillars, evidence that he had once been low in a line he now served. They laughed because assumptions felt like power. They laughed because the sight of a black delivery man in a uniform was easy to narrate into a joke. The laughter felt safe in a place that prized appearance and status. It didn't occur to them that someone who understood every cog in the restaurant might one day be more than the party played. Elijah's deliveries were efficient, each signature crisp. He checked the invoice, acknowledged the chef with a nod, kept the dolly's wheels clear of the kitchen tiles. He did not let the small humiliations derail him. The staff's nicknames and their soft mockeries slid off him like water on feathers. He had learned to trust that work required him to keep his center. There's a kind of dignity in showing up and doing the job as if the job itself mattered more than anyone's opinion of you. As the morning stretched, the rhythm inside the restaurant rose like a tide. Orders flew in. Servers smoothed napkins with sharp palms. Steam breathed out from pots. In the corner by the pass, someone knocked a stack of menus deliberately, as if to startle Elijah. Laughter came again, less private now, more like an official sound. They egged each other on, gathering courage in numbers. "Easy on him," Greg said, half to himself. He didn't mean easy as in kindness. He meant it as a reminder that the front-of-house reputation required everyone to play their part. That part, for many, included a chorus of superiority, an invisible uniform stitched into the fabric of the place. Elijah paused, hand on a crate, and for a moment looked at the dining room beyond the swinging doors. Patrons sipped their coffee, unaware of the little currents of cruelty in the back. The chandelier's light threw filigree across the white tablecloths, an emblem, he thought, of the contrast of surfaces. On one side, refinement and polish. On the other, the alley's grit and the people who kept the gears turning. He finished the delivery. He left the receipt with Greg. He said, "Have a good shift," in a tone that left room for no reply. He walked back through the alley, and the city noise swallowed him like a tide. He moved with the dignity of someone who had learned how to be seen, but not defined by the narrow lens others offered. A day later, Elijah returned. This time he carried a different kind of weight. No dolly, no boxes. He carried a thin leather folder under his arm and a key in his hand. The key was small, unremarkable, but it fit into a pocket like a quiet, inevitable thing. He had walked out of the courier's truck and into the front of the house with a calm that felt like a plan. On the schedule board, someone had written "staff meeting" in black marker and underlined it like an afterthought. The staff assumed it was another manager's temper, another routine reprimand or change in menu. They came in with their usual advantages, half smirks, a readiness to murmur about the man who delivered boxes. Damien leaned against the pass with a clean towel draped over one shoulder. "All right, gather up," he said in the chef's cadence that stilled the room. Quick meeting. The room collected like fish at a feeding. Servers dropped dresses on chairs, men draped aprons, someone tucked a pen behind an ear. The chatter died down into a hum of expectation. They did not yet know what change would walk through the door. Elijah came in without fanfare. The staff looked past him, at first seeing only the person who'd rolled a dolly days before. He stood before the team with a composure that carried no need to be loud. Calm can make a room uneasy because it refuses to play the script. He placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly with the careful gestures of someone unwrapping something significant but not theatrical. People exchanged glances. It was the same language they used when a bottle is passed around for opinions. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Damien's jaw tightened into an officer's line. Elijah caught Damien's eye, and in that exchange, something ancient and fierce moved across the room. A recognition not of power, but of a missed assumption. "My name is Elijah Reynolds," he said, and the sound of his voice settled into the room. "I'm the new owner." The words landed not as an accusation, but as an undeniable fact. Silence ripped through the kitchen like a dropped plate. For a second, someone's hand kept reaching for a comment and then froze. A smirk wilted. The laughter that had been rehearsed dissolved into the kind of quiet that made people aware of their mouths. The staff reacted in the ways people do when the world rearranges itself beneath their feet. Damien's expression flickered between disbelief and the old armor of command. Greg's shoulders rounded as if to make room for an apology that didn't quite know how to form. "You... what?" Damien asked, not loud but pointed. It was a defensive sound, the first buck of a man whose territory felt suddenly unfamiliar. Elijah's eyes were level. He did not triumph. He did not gloat. There is a kind of power that arrives without spectacle, and it helped the fact that he spoke plainly cut through the room. "I closed the agreement last week," he said. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. The papers in the folder were not for display. They were the kind of quiet proof that changes a room more effectively than shouts. He set a key on the table. Keys are small icons of reality. They lock things, and they open others. "What are you doing?" a young server demanded, more because her voice had not yet learned diplomacy than because she wanted the answer. "I'm here to run Bell Andrea's," Elijah replied. "To manage it. To be responsible for what's on these walls and what happens behind them." He paused and looked at each face. No scapegoating, no relish. That includes how we treat people who come through our doors, suppliers, delivery workers, line cooks, servers. Respect isn't optional here. It's how this place operates. A low murmur began, like one of those currents the staff had used to buoy their mockery. Respect costs nothing, one of them said under their breath, almost unintentionally, and the phrase threaded through the room. Elijah had been ready for the language of apology because he had listened for it in the alley. But it was not enough. Damien's mouth moved again. "We were just," he said, then stopped. The ellipsis was a small window into a mind trying to find justification in habit. Elijah met his stare. "You were treating a man like a joke," he said. "That's a management issue now, not a gossip one. Not a thing we laugh about in corners. We're better than small, cruel things. If we're not, we should be honest about it." Nobody cheered. That was not the point. The point was that a company of people who had rehearsed contempt found the rehearsal interrupted by reality. The small, cruel things that had once been private now had a manager who would be required to act. Greg stepped forward, hands spread the way people do when they try to appear conciliatory. "Elijah, this is a lot. We never meant—" "Intent matters," Elijah said, "but it doesn't absolve impact." His voice was firm, not accusatory. He had the patience of someone who had scraped plates for years and learned that change takes more than words. "If you're sorry, I'll accept that. But I'm asking for more than apologies. Actions speak louder than words." He laid out something practical with a calm efficiency that matched his earlier work. Changes to training, an open-door policy for suppliers and staff, scheduled listening sessions where people would come and speak honestly about how the back of house treated the people who served them. He did not prescribe public shaming. He demanded accountability and visible steps. "You will not be punished for being wrong," he said. "You will be expected to do something about being wrong." Damien's shoulders tightened in a challenge that might once have become a confrontation. Instead, something else happened. A small surrender. He knew kitchens well enough to know when the temperature in the room had shifted. He could bark orders. He could not, without losing something deeper, command a room into contrition. He stood there, and the look on his face was not simple shame. It was recognition of a loophole he had exploited, until it was closed. "I apologize," he said. The words were not rushed. They carried the weight of a man reading off a script he had not practiced. "I didn't see." He stopped again, because the seeing was part of the work he would have to do. Words alone were insufficient. Elijah nodded. "Say it to him," Elijah suggested. Damien opened his mouth but then closed it. The staff's earlier laughter had not been directed at some faceless thing. It had been pointed at a man, and now that man was standing in a room with authority, the way the staff had never expected. The shift in power changed the geometry of accountability. Elijah didn't require a performative capitulation. He required work. "We're going to institute shared shifts," he said. "You're going to spend time on the receiving dock, talking to the people who bring things here. You're going to join the listening sessions I mentioned. You'll all have to participate in a plan to improve how we operate. Words will follow action." Greg swallowed. The rest of the team leaned forward, not because they wanted to, but because the blueprint of their day had been altered by something real. A man they'd written off as less than them had the power to set new rules. There was no victory lap for Elijah. He did not close with some theatrical flourish. He simply asked for names to be put on schedules, dates to be set, and for the staff to begin the work of undoing the small cruelties that had become normalized. A manager's job is heavy with the responsibility of both enforcing standards and modeling them. Elijah intended to do both. After the meeting, people remained in the kitchen with their hands idle for the first time all shift, processing. Some of the younger servers exchanged looks that carried the new vocabulary of being caught. Others, like Damien, stood with a rigidness that suggested he had been thrown from a familiar carriage. There is a particular silence that arrives when performance art of superiority is interrupted by legal fact. It invites reflection. A week later, the first listening session took place. It was not a spectacle, but a table where people, suppliers, delivery drivers, dishwashers, servers, sat down with the staff of Andrea's. They told small truths about being dismissed, about the margins of work where dignity frayed. The staff listened, some faces reddening, others leaning forward as if trying to learn a language they'd never bothered to study. Action was the currency Elijah wanted. Damien volunteered to take a shift on the receiving dock for a few mornings. He showed up early, hands raw in the cold, lifting boxes and learning names of people he'd once called invisible. The first morning he arrived, a delivery man he'd often joked about met his eye and simply said, "Thanks," with no trace of the old script that had amused the kitchen. Damien's face shifted in a way that was more instructive than any apology. There was humility in labor, an element that remodels relationships with proof. Greg enrolled the front-of-house team in workshops about supplier relations. They learned to hold a conversation that didn't stop at a dismissive quip. The young servers who had once laughed found themselves writing thank you on receipts, starting to mean it. It was slow and imperfect and damnably human. None of this wiped clean the earlier mockeries. The memory of small cruelties lived like a stubborn stain. That was the point. Culture change is not instantaneous. Elijah never promised instant redemption. He insisted on visible commitment, and then watched to see whether that commitment would outlast discomfort. The restaurant's nameplate still had its shine. The chandeliers still scattered light. The alley was still a place where hands carried boxes through dust. But there was a new cadence. The clink of a crate no longer accompanied by a corner laugh. People who had once rehearsed superiority found themselves rehearsing something different. Politeness followed by curiosity, curiosity followed by learning. It was not theatrical, and it was not complete. It was a start. Eventually, someone asked Elijah why he had returned to this place to make it his own. Why choose the restaurant that had been so quick to snicker at him when it would have been easier to buy something new and unmarked by memory? He replied simply, "Because I know how kitchens work. I know what goes on in the back. I started here. I know what it takes to make a place run. I can't change every restaurant, but I can change this one." His words were practical, not messianic. He had not become owner to avenge slight. He had become owner to build a culture where dignity was structural. The staff's embarrassment was not a trophy to be displayed. It was a moment to be learned from. Elijah never flaunted their discomfort. He did not savor it. The reveal was not the story's climax because of humiliation. It was its pivot because it exposed assumptions and forced a reckoning. Over time, customers started to notice a different energy. The front-of-house team had a steadier warmth. Delivery drivers were met at the back door with names, not smugness. The change was modest, the kind of thing that often goes unnoticed unless someone points it out. But the small things add up. Respect stacked like plates, one after another. Damien found himself sometimes pausing by the receiving dock when Elijah came in early to check inventory. There, in the convergence of practicality and humility, he'd ask, "Need a hand?" and mean it. The awkwardness eased into collaboration. He apologized again, this time not because he was asked to, but because seeing a man he had underestimated was no longer abstract. It was a daily reality. What changed everything in that room was not a single act of revenge. It was the quiet authority of a man who refused to let jokes remain unexamined. It was the insistence that respect be non-negotiable. When Elijah said his name and declared himself owner, the sound of that name turned laughter into reflection. Name carries truth. Name carries history and possibility. Elijah's dignity did not depend on his title. He had been a man of dignity before the ownership papers existed. He had been patient and competent long before a key changed hands. Becoming the owner did not validate his worth. It gave him the authority to require that worth be recognized in the way the restaurant ran. That was the lesson he wanted the staff to learn. In the weeks that followed, the staff were not uniformly transformed. People made mistakes. Old habits peeked out in corners. But when those habits appeared, they were met with a different baseline. The expectation of accountability. No more whispered jokes in the alley. No more petty pranks to signal belonging. If someone slipped, they were asked to repair what their behavior had harmed. The lesson extended beyond the kitchen. Regulars began to tell one another how they'd been greeted, how someone had taken the time to thank the person who delivered their bread. Small things like that reframed the customer's experience and, more importantly, reframed the staff's internal script about who belonged in which place. By the time the story of Elijah's reveal began to move beyond the staff room into the neighborhood, it had already done the essential work. It had stopped a pattern at its source and required the people who'd participated in cruelty to do something about it. That is the only kind of justice that builds durable change. Not spectacle, but responsibility. On a late afternoon, when the light came down at a low angle and gilded the brass letters of Bell Andrea's, Elijah stood by the door and watched people move through his restaurant. A delivery driver he'd seen before stopped and lifted a hand in acknowledgement. Elijah returned it with a nod, not as a statement, but as the simple business of recognition. "You changed things here," the delivery man said casually, as if they were commenting on the weather. Elijah shook his head. "We changed things," he said. "It wasn't just me." The delivery man smiled, an easy thing, and pushed onward. Elijah's name had not erased the past. It had rearranged how the present was lived. That made all the difference. They had laughed at the black delivery man, and their laughter had been a mirror revealing their small cruelties. But one name, spoken plainly, backed by action, changed the geometry of that room. It made people aware of what they had been doing in the margins and gave them a way to repair it. It made respect a rule rather than an option. The final image hangs on that brass plate over the doorway. Bell Andrea's fine dining, letters catching the late sun. Inside, a team works with a different caution, one that edges toward kindness. Outside, Elijah's hand rests on the door, as if to steady it for anyone who might enter. There is no triumphalism in that gesture, only steadiness. If this story spoke to you, and you want to see more moments where people are challenged to be better, consider subscribing. These are the kinds of stories that remind us, quietly and firmly, that dignity costs nothing, and action costs everything. When people choose to laugh at someone, they often do so because it's smaller than looking at their own assumptions. When a single truth, one name, walks into a room and refuses to be dismissed, the laughter stops. The rest is work. If you've ever been judged unfairly, or if you've ever been the one who misjudged someone, share that moment in the comments. Tell us how you changed your mind, or what it took for you to see someone else differently. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share the video with them. Stories are how we begin to learn. They laughed at the black delivery man. Then one name changed everything.